Okay, it is the stroke of 6:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started in deference to our webcast participants. Welcome, everybody. My name is Deb Baxley, and I'm happy to be your moderator here tonight. The topic tonight is what's next for the payment networks in a world of faster payments. And as we've been watching Visa and MasterCard make a lot of interesting strategic moves over the past 5 years, and maybe in the past few months even more interestingly, looking at their acquisitions and strategic partnerships. So it struck us that as a payments group, this is something that's really interesting to think about. It should reveal something about their strategies. And we thought it would be useful to investigate, are their strategies diverging? Are MasterCard and Visa going slightly separate directions? And what does that mean for the payments industry? So again, my name is Deb Baxley, and I am one of the co-founders and board member of NYPAY. And you'll see a common thread of everybody here tonight has between 25 and 30 years experience in the payments industry. So I don't know if that means that we're just really, really experienced or all just old. But I have about 25 years of experience in the consulting to the payments industry. I worked for IBM and then Capgemini, and now I have my own firm with two partners called PayGility Advisors. And I'm one of the proud co-founders of NYPAY. I think we've been around for about 7 years. And I'd like to point out three other members of the NYPAY management that are here tonight. My partner in crime back there, Christian Gennaro. Maria Dalbert, where are you? And Maureen O'Rourke. Where is she? There she is. Thank you all. Normally you have David True as our kind of the father of NYPAY, but he is traveling this week. And he might be on the webcast. He probably is. Hi, David. Before I introduce the panel, we assemble a really good panel, people with unique perspectives on the payment networks. But we asked to poll the audience just to get a sense for what kind of audience we have. How many people here work for banks? Okay. How about for payment networks? Just a couple. How about consultants? Okay. How about vendors to the payments industry, software vendors or whatever? Okay, great. Thank you. So let me introduce the panel. Starting from the far right, we have Dan Gonzalez, who's the VP of the Payments Industry Relations for the Federal Reserve Customer Relations and Support Office, and he has over 20 years experience in financial services. At the Fed, he's responsible for collaborating with the industry to define and prioritize payment system improvements that advance speed, efficiency, and security of payments. He works with the top 25 financial institutions, payment networks, and alternative payment providers. And he spent the last several years working with financial institutions on efforts to migrate payments to electronic and to improve efficiency. And then next to him, we have Steve Ledford, who is the SVP of Product and Strategy at The Clearing House. And for those of you who may not be aware of The Clearing House, is a very old company, founded in 1860?
1853, and I wasn't there.
Oh, you weren't there? I was going to ask you what it was like back then. Originally, I think it was founded to literally clear paper checks.
Yeah.
And, of course, it's added a lot of things to its mission since then. So the Clearinghouse, or TCH for short, provides core payment systems clearing and settlement nearly $2 trillion daily, provides advocacy and thought leadership to the industry. And Steve has advised leading banks and financial services firms in the U.S. for more than 30 years. He's well-known and highly regarded thought leader in the payment industry. He was formerly a partner with Novantas, a financial services consulting firm, and leader at McKinsey's global payments practice. We're all familiar with the great white papers that McKinsey puts out. And he was president of Global Concepts, a consulting and research firm specializing in payments and cash management. And incidentally, Christiane and Dan and Steve and I are all on the Federal Reserve Faster Payments Task Force. Is anybody else here on the Faster Payments? Oh, yes, Rod. Great. We have several members of the Faster Payments Task Force. We'll hear more about that tonight because it's part of the topic of conversation.
You guys are going to keep me honest, right?
Yes. Okay, then we have Craig Maurer, who's a partner with the Payments and Financial Technology of Autonomous Research, which is a leading independent research provider on financial services companies globally. He's been on Wall Street for 20 years at Neuberger Berman as a portfolio analyst before he moved to the sell side in 1999, 10 years in research covering payments processing and specialty finance and mid-cap banks prior to that. He was named Wall Street Journal's Best on the Street ranking in 2006 and 2008, and Financial Times ranking in 2008 and 2013. And then finally, my former colleague at Capgemini, Anand Ramakrishnan, who is the president and CEO of Opus Consulting Solutions, which is a consulting firm that specializes almost entirely in the retail payments area. And he has over 22 years of in-depth focus in banking and payments. He was formerly the SVP of Banking Business Unit at Capgemini Financial Services, had sales responsibility for North America. He was also the founding member of a company called Canbay International in 1995 and senior management team that was acquired by Capgemini in 2006. He's been named one of the top fintech influencers in the U.S. and published by Let's Talk Payments in 2016. And interestingly, one of the reasons we really wanted Anand on this panel was that one of MasterCard's key acquisitions in 2014 was a platform called Electrocard, which at that time was owned by Opus Consulting. It was Opus Software at that time, and that's one of the key things that MasterCard acquired. So that gives Anand a unique insight into MasterCard's strategy. All right, so thank you, panelists. I'm going to start with sort of a broad question and ask you all to weigh in on it. First of all, I think probably everybody here has heard over the past couple of months that both Visa and MasterCard announced strategic partnerships with PayPal. I think Visa did first and then MasterCard followed up. And from my understanding, what the partnership consists of is that PayPal agrees to formerly PayPal would advantage ACH, and if you've used PayPal, they kind of would try to get you to use ACH instead of a credit card. They'd let you use a credit card, but they made it easier to use ACH, and that was because of pricing. So what the deal with PayPal is that they will treat all the payment types equally, so they won't advantage ACH over Visa and MasterCard cards. But then also Visa and MasterCard will kind of pave the way to accept PayPal at the point of sale. That's my understanding of the partnership. We went back and looked at all of these companies and partnerships that Visa and MasterCard have done over the past 5 years. It does seem that Visa has been more focused on network expansion. So there's PayPal, but then there's also, they acquired Clear Exchange. They acquired Visa Europe, which when Visa went public a few years ago, Visa Europe kind of went their own way. Now they're back in the fold. And also, they formed this partnership with Chase called ChaseNet. They also made a number of mobile acquisitions, Fundamo, Monetize, and PlaySpan, which is for digital goods. But MasterCard seems to have been more focused on real-time payments and processing. I mentioned they bought Electrocard. They also, the big thing a couple weeks ago is they bought Vocalink, which is a huge software company that's behind a lot of the world's real-time payment systems. They bought a smaller company called Payment Gateway Services. And they've also spent a lot of time investing in loyalty and analytics. They bought companies called 5-1 Marketing, Chomp, True Access, Pinpoint, et cetera. So I would ask the panel to each weigh in on what do these and other moves imply about each network's attempts to grow, and how well do you think the networks have leveraged these investments? So whoever wants to start.
You guys are all looking for me. Okay, go ahead.
I can speak more to MasterCard than to Visa. Have I guess outsiders' view to the Visa world. Your point about MasterCard focusing on core payment network and backbone, seems to bear fruit. A lot of what even their acquisition of Electra, which was a couple of years ago. I have to be very careful about what I say with respect to that acquisition, but more. Even their new wallet program, which seems to be the basis of everything they do, seems to drive towards them being a provider to the banks to white label and then be a backbone, technology backbone that networks to enable processing payments. They're on all their acquisitions, right? And it seems more the Voca acquisition, which you just alluded to, seems to point to what I see MasterCard's strategy being. Let's take a digital point of sale and be the connector to any payment instrument that sits at the back end. And, some of it could be in relation to, let me also have a P2P offering and, things of that nature. But really, the underlying thing is I suspect they're viewing card and non-card to be interoperable, and they will be the network that connects it. So as a consumer, you could make a payment using a digital point, and you could end up choosing any which way of payment, and MasterCard will be the backbone that enables it, right? And Visa seems to be more direct to consumer with their acquisition, and even the all the moves they made around the wallet seems to be a little more trying to do similar things, but the approach seems different.
By the way, I forgot to mention, well, you guys can ask questions anytime you want. We're very informal here at NYPAY. But also, those of you on the webcast, if you have a question, use the hashtag NYPAY, hashtag NYPAY. You can also use that for Twitter, just hashtag NYPAY. So just wanted to bring the people in the webcast in. Who else wants to weigh in?
All right, I'll jump in.
Dan.
And before I start, I always have to give my disclaimer. So any comments or opinions that I express are solely those of my own and not reflective of the Federal Reserve or any Federal Reserve system or policy. So now that we got that out of the way, we can have a nice little conversation. So don't hashtag me in any of those things that I might
Controversial.
say. So it is though challenging for me to comment directly on any of those networks specifically. But what I can say a little bit more broadly, and I'll try to tie into what they're both doing. But if you think back maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was, we started some dialogue with the industry. When I said we, the Fed, started some dialogue with the industry around payments improvement initiatives, one specifically around payment speed and what we need to do to really bring faster payments or real-time payments to the U.S. marketplace. And when we started that dialogue, there was actually a little bit of pushback saying, hey, we've got a great payment system here in the U.S. Do we really need this thing? What are we talking about? Faster payments? We got ACH, we got wire, we got cards. So that was kind of where the conversation started. And, as we went through some discussion with the industry and industry participants, the conversation over time really evolved to, okay, well, yeah, there are reasons and there's specific use cases where the U.S. payment system can benefit, even though it's probably one of the strongest and best payment systems globally. There's been areas that we could really improve and make some benefits, especially around payment speed, where the payment speed today doesn't match up with some of the existing payment networks and processes. So that conversation shifted over the last couple of years, and now we're going through another shift. I think now we're not talking about if we need them or when we're going to need them, but now how we're going to get there. And I think that's what you're seeing in some of these moves, is some of these networks and various players start to play out how they can potentially participate in a real-time payments capability. So, both MasterCard and Visa are participating on our Faster Payments Task Force. So they are involved in the work that is underway. I'll talk a little bit more about the task force itself and some of the work that's being done there. But those folks are playing in that space. So I think some of what you're seeing is a play out of the conversations that have been had over the last couple of years, where folks are now starting to position themselves on how they're going to play in potentially a new payment solution down the road.
Great.
All right.
Steve?
And without talking about particular companies, one, I don't really know that much about what's going on inside of these companies. I'm more of a plumbing and wholesale kind of guy, but it's, if I'm a public company, I want to grow. A public company that grows is a much better than one that doesn't grow. And if you already are ginormous in cards, you got to find other places to grow. And I do think you can either, one thing about payments are, it's not just one thing. There's how you make payments, and there's how you clear and settle payments. It seems that this is focusing on how people are making payments and trying to extend reach through that way. MasterCard's looking more toward the middle. The fact is both are needed, and I don't know how to handicap which is the better strategy, the better business to be in, but I mean, it does seem to be pretty distinct, but I think it's all just, you gotta grow, and there's only so many ways to do it. There's not much more to do than just good old-fashioned cards.
Okay. Craig?
I guess I'm the outsider who's not actually working directly in the industry, but all I do is look at it. So, in the MasterCard versus Visa discussion, I think I think what you're seeing is Visa is focusing on its core attributes, focusing on being the best partner to the issuers, focusing on driving point of sale, and also remember that Visa as a management team is going to be highly distracted over the next 4 years integrating a European business that frankly was a failure of the IPO not to have part of a global organization. And whereas MasterCard, in our view, I think it's less about focusing in a different direction, but more about MasterCard's number 2, and they're the clear number 2. They're half the size. And they have to be able to compete in every single conversation that happens around payments. And assets like VocaLink, loyalty assets, MasterCard Advisors is a huge component of that. All these things are playing into MasterCard building the best data analytics engine in the world, and perhaps also, at least when it comes to payments, and they're also going to be the only payment network with scale that we know of that could go into a government, an issuer, a retailer, and say, what type of payment do you want? Because we can do it, and we can do every single one of them, and we're best in class. And that's through VocaLink, that's through their card network and whatnot. So it's clearly about being number 2 and making sure that they are building a platform that they can compete with as Visa grows bigger and bigger with larger and larger scale advantages and so on and so forth. Visa's a little bit, I also think it's important to recognize that everything Visa does is Visa first. It's brand first. Visa does nothing without their name stamped on it, whereas MasterCard's brand is very happy to sit in the background. So I also think that's important. One thing you guys didn't comment on was the PayPal question, which is a question that's near and dear to what I'm working on. But in my view, PayPal made a deal staring down the barrel of a gun, and they essentially were being told a couple things. We're about, through EMVCO 3DS version 2, we're about to create pricing structures that you can't participate in. You will be at a disadvantage from cost. We are going to put a 2-stage wallet fee on you. If you're Visa, that's higher than MasterCard's, because let's be honest, Visa doesn't do anything in pricing that isn't higher than MasterCard. And we are going to make your life very difficult to operate. And while they had a very nice hold hands moment in their press release that was joint, if you read PayPal's press release or earnings release, they were very clear that they did this under threat and that this is not going to be healthy for their economics. And there is nothing, despite what was said outwardly, that Visa and MasterCard are going to do to smooth PayPal's road into brick and mortar retail. All they've done is something that's at their own advantage, which is they've gotten PayPal to tokenize on the Visa and MasterCard standard, which was, or the EMVCO standard, I should say, which is extremely important considering guys like the clearinghouse are looking to build token vaults that compete with Visa and MasterCard, and they need everybody to be on that standard. So PayPal can present every token that Visa and MasterCard have out there, but they don't get a single penny in revenue for doing so. And so it does, in my opinion, PayPal made a deal they wish they didn't have to, and they're being very good at spinning it right now. So,
Does that generate any questions from the audience?
I do have one.
Yeah.
So if MasterCard is pursuing more of a processing white label and Visa is more direct to consumer, my brand on everything, doesn't that eventually hurt, this is for Craig, doesn't that eventually hurt their pricing though? Because you know, a lot of the revenue that they generate is quote, you know, brand value as well as transaction processing. So doesn't that ultimately hurt them long term?
I think they look at the world with the view that per transaction economics are essentially a melting ice cube, regardless of what they do. And that over the long term, in fact, they said this, Ajay Banga said this at the Investor Day, that their expectation is that over the long term, per transaction economics erode. And the truth is, their services business is growing revenue now 25%. Their core is growing at 10%. Their services business has a growing margin. Their core has a static to declining margin. They are doing what they need to do to essentially drive shareholder value for the long term and ensure their position. Whereas I think Visa would have aggressively been bidding on VocaLink if they were not tied up with Visa Europe and if they weren't the dominant debit player in the UK. Visa has said, they're interesting because I remember this at the time of the IPO when I asked them if their management at the time, MasterCard has this great business and advisors, it's revenue generating, it's growing fast, where's your competitor? And their answer at the time was, we don't have one, it's been our mistake, we're just thinking about starting one. And in fact, I believe they're now looking to outsource a lot of that data analytics because they have not been successful in building the same type of revenue generating capability in-house.
You're saying MasterCard hasn't or Visa?
Visa hasn't.
Hasn't, okay.
Yeah.
Because they don't have anything that really competes with advisors.
Advisor seems like a unique beast. I mean, you guys in the room would know better than me, but I haven't really been able to find something that has that quality of data to sell to issuers, merchants, and governments around the world.
Okay, I hope somebody tweets this memorable per transaction economics is a melting ice cube. Somebody has to tweet that. That's pretty good. Okay, so Dan, before we go into how real-time payments is driving some of this strategic shifts, can you just give us a little thumbnail sketch of the Faster Payments Initiative?
Sure, I can give you a quick update. So we do have
Six of us.
Six of us that are here
Yeah,
that
we're
are
busy
on
reading
that are busy
proposals.
reading some work that we put out there for you. So yeah, let me give you a quick 7-minute overview of the work that we've been doing. So back in 2015, January of 2015, don't know how many people have taken a look at it, but the Fed released a strategies for improving the U.S. payment system paper, which basically was a culmination of a lot of research that we had done with the industry, getting feedback on where there was areas of opportunity for improvement around payments, where there was gaps and challenges, putting that all together. And what we came up with was a number of desired outcomes, again, that was informed by all this research that we did around improving payment speed, payment safety, and security, payment efficiency. A little international component because there was some feedback that we got there about, international payments. There's probably a little more friction than we need there, so there may be some areas that we can make some improvements there. We basically launched this paper, and part of that strategy, the one tactic that we used was to launch what we call the Faster Payments Task Force. How many folks are familiar with the task force and some of the work that's being done? So there's a few more other than the ones that are on there. Good. So we launched that in June of 2015 was the launch of the task force itself. And it's made up with folks from across the whole spectrum of the industry. So it includes financial institutions, network providers, service providers, academia, consultants, consumer interest groups, government regulators and agencies. So it's the whole breadth, as well as consumers and business users. So it's the whole breadth of the payments ecosystem, all the participants that would normally participate. Task Force is currently about 320 individuals and organizations that are participating. So again, very diverse great group of people that are very vested in making some of these improvements. So over the last few months, I'll just highlight a couple of the key deliverables that the task force has accomplished. So one of the things that they accomplished in January of this year was they released what they call the effectiveness criteria, which was basically a set of guidelines. It's not standards or anything like that because there's nothing that would mandate use of these, but it was a criteria that essentially laid out really from an aspirational perspective what real-time payments could potentially look like in the U.S. marketplace. So taking the input from all these diverse stakeholders and saying, here's what we think real-time payments could look like in the U.S. And they basically set out the different criteria around payment speed, payment security. Actually, almost a whole third of the criteria are related to payment security. So you can't talk about payment speed without talking about security of those payments. Ubiquity, how is the process going to work across the board? Because we have a lot of what look like, and some of them have been mentioned up here, look like and feel like real-time payments capabilities, but they're happening in payment, what we typically refer to as closed payment communities. So for me to participate, I've got to be a participant or a member of that payment community in order to participate. So the task force laid out these 36 criteria, a number of sub-criteria, and said, industry, here's kind of what we'd like to see from a real-time payments capability in the U.S. So the next step that they took was to actually call upon service providers to say, here's the criteria. We're opening this up for you to tell us how you could potentially meet these objectives for the criteria and meet the real-time payments objective for the U.S. marketplace. We had a number of proposers submit solutions that had to cover the whole gamut of all the criteria as well as cover the process, really from end to end, from the initiation of the payment all the way up to the receipt of the payment. They laid that out there. Had a number of proposers come forward. Actually 22 were accepted into the process. And we actually went through what we called a QIAT assessment, which was a qualified independent assessment team review, which was actually facilitated by McKinsey and Company to actually look at all the proposals that were submitted and then give an assessment against the criteria to say how each one of those proposals did against the various criteria. Where we are right now is those proposals have now been released to the task force. So the proposals and the assessments are now with the task force, where the task force is now taking a look at those and going to provide their input into the overall process to say, hey, there's some great ideas here. Maybe there's some ideas in this one. Did you think about this other option or alternative that might help this way? So again, trying to enrich, and the terminology that we typically use is lift all boats. So the goal here was not to pick a solution or a winner through this process, but it was to help to inform the providers and the marketplace about what potential processes or capabilities existed to bringing real-time payments to the U.S. So that is underway right now within the task force. So those proposers, there's actually 19 proposers that elected to move forward within the task force with their solutions. The other ones that elected to kind of step aside, that was their choice. It was a point that we had that they had the opportunity to make that decision to move forward to the task force or not. So they just elected to not move forward. So we have 19. That review is underway. Like Deborah mentioned, there's a lot of homework for all the task force participants to do. They're looking at about 3,200 pages worth of proposal material and assessment. So they're taking a dive into that work and providing their feedback. So that will come out later this year, or I'm sorry, next steps, I should say. So they'll finish up their work at the end of this year, reviewing those proposals. And then we'll do some additional work, and there's some work underway to actually create what the task force is calling a final report from the task force. The first piece is going to be laying out kind of the landscape and background of the U.S. payments market and how we got to where we are. And then the second phase of the report, which will be due out in mid-2017, will then provide all the proposals and assessments and the task force input into those assessments, and then kind of lay out what they're calling the challenges and opportunities to move real-time payments into the U.S. marketplace. And then the last piece of that will be some recommended next steps from the task force. So there are things, and the one thing that we wanted to be clear about this process is that we know there's market developments, there's folks that are bringing different capabilities to the marketplace today. This in no means was meant to slow that down or stall it, but it was really meant to enrich it and try to identify where some, maybe more systemic gaps and challenges are that maybe one or two providers can't solve on their own, but maybe needs to take a look from a payment system perspective to see where we need to address some of those gaps and opportunities. So that was the 5-minute summary of what's going on there, but there's a lot of work and great work, and the commitment from the folks that are participating on the task force, as well as the proposers that have come forward with these solutions, has been phenomenal.
So I don't know if you are aware, but I think the U.S. is maybe the 12th country to launch a faster payments initiative. The U.K. is probably one of the most high profile, but there was Singapore, Poland, Australia, and the list goes on and on. So I've often heard that one of the reasons that the U.S. decided to do this was just embarrassment being one major factor that we were behind 12 other countries.
Well, we talk about that, the U.S. being a little behind, but
Yeah.
it's not really behind when you look at it
Not in the
globally.
overall
But certainly could from a real-time perspective if we don't have something in place. And that's actually a good point, because those countries, most of those countries went through a different process to get to where we are headed. Most of those countries were either had a central bank or government mandate to implement real-time payments capabilities in their marketplaces. Here in the U.S., we're a little bit of a different marketplace, a little bit larger, a little bit more diverse. And this is not a mandate. It's not something the Fed is mandating or can actually mandate. So we're going through this collaborative approach of really having the industry try to drive to these desired outcomes. And we were clear in the paper that this was our intent, that we want the industry. So some of these moves that we're seeing and different work that's being done by other providers are certainly in line with some of those desired outcomes to make some of these improvements.
So Anand and Craig and Steve, any comments that you might have, perspectives on how the whole umbrella of faster payments might be affecting Visa and MasterCard or the payments industry in general?
One thing, I mean, first of all, really have to commend the Fed for convening this caravan, or whatever you want to call it. It's just this big, all the folks in the industry getting together to figure out what we want to do. It's definitely gotten some folks interested, lit a few fires. You mentioned that there are 19. We are one of the ones proposing to move forward. We've self-announced.
They can self-announce.
We can self-announce, so I'm not breaking any rules there. But I don't think we would be anywhere near where we are if it weren't for this. And I think it's got the industry thinking. And one of the great things about it is, by not being the first to the party, we could learn from what other folks have done. Personally, I think a mandate is about the worst way of doing this. And the reason is you do exactly what you've been asked to do and no more. And I think we can do it better. First of all, we can learn from what's happening in other countries. We can also do it better because we have to. We have to convince people this is something worth doing. And I think what you're going to see here is a richer, faster payments experience. I think it's going to have more functionality. It will obviously be uniquely tuned to the fact that we've got, 13, 14. We don't even know how many financial institutions we have. I mean, I think that's one of the most fascinating things.
The number, 1,000.
Yes, it's a big number. And I think we'll find it used in different ways. And I think that's all good, because the good thing about it is when there's a whole lot of different things you can do, what's it going to be used for? How is it changing the industry? We don't know. And that's the beautiful thing about it. I like to say when Tim Berners-Lee was thinking up, the internet or the World Wide Web, he probably wasn't thinking about Uber, and he definitely wasn't thinking about cat videos. But the fact is, you get a new tool and you can use it in a lot of different ways.
Cat videos.
Cat videos.
Another tweetable moment. Okay.
I think MasterCard's clearly thinking about this. I mean, as far as I understand, VocalLink is, you guys are contracting with VocalLink for their software.
That's correct.
Yeah, and they're also providing capability to Singapore and other places, and they clearly dominate the UK faster payments. So MasterCard clearly sees a future here. I think Visa's stance has been, well, we're smart people, and if there's a reason to do it, we'll do it, and we'll be the best at it. And I think that's kind of their view of it. So I think they're going to be caught flat-footed to a degree in the same way they were around the data question we were talking about before. But in the U.S., in my view, you have a challenging environment. Banks like interchange. They like credit interchange. They like lending money and earning spreads. And they're not going to do that if faster payments goes to retail. And so you're going to be battling your own constituents if you're trying to bring it to retail, in my view, to a degree.
Yeah.
But it's got enormous applicability in C2B and bill pay and all sorts of other applications that have nothing to do with retail payments.
And we have no aspirations to retail.
Yeah, that's what you guys have said. And so,
It's, yeah, for lots of reasons.
Anand, any?
Yeah, again, I go back to with the, different payment instruments converging at some point with digitization. I agree with you. MasterCard seems to see, has seen that this is probably a reality, and they want to be the first to market to be able to get to, an integrated payment offering. And I think the impact for Visa obviously is, they've got to think about where they play in the chain, and MasterCard will use this to get to a converged model globally, right? And I think the idea of VOCA, there were drivers for VOCA to sell the company, but clearly MasterCard's strategic vision, if I tie it to what they did with the acquisition of Electra from us, is to try and build a global core payment engine, and that will, and MasterCard be the one-stop shop for all payment processing, or the leader.
Now, what was the driver? The UK government was sort of suggesting.
So for VOCA, at least from what I understand, there was regulatory pressure to open it up to non-bank participants. They were a consortium owned by banks.
Okay.
There was and open it up to competition and open it up to retail. I think that was a key driver behind wanting to monetize.
and I think the government was frustrated that the banks had stopped investing and moving the platform forward.
Okay, that's interesting. I was planning to orient this question to Dan, but all of you can weigh in on it. As real-time payments become the new normal sometime in the future, do you think we'll see pretty ubiquitous interoperability of cards and other payment networks, like with the rise of e-commerce, m-commerce, and tokenization increasingly? You don't really have cards anymore. The whole concept of card present, card not present is kind of getting fuzzy. So will these interoperate with card and non-card payments?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that first, and certainly you guys chime in. But one of the things that we were pretty clear on when we released the strategy paper was that there was a desire to have a faster, safer, ubiquitous payment system. So my comments around the closed payment communities can have multiple providers, but then how do they getting to the point of interoperability? How do they work together? And one of the things that the task force said pretty clearly was that ubiquity had to be part of that, and interoperability had to be defined by the service providers. So if you actually look at our criteria that they published, you'll actually see there's a number of specific criteria that actually dive into and mention interoperability. So the proposers were asked to answer each one of those questions. So as the task force is starting to dive through some of those proposals, is going to be taking a look at how do the various solution providers address the question of ubiquity, interoperability. So, the task force has kind of said this might be a problem or a challenge going forward, because we can certainly have multiple providers, but when you think about the payment systems and the way they work today, if I have my account at Chase, and I'm just using that as an example, and Steve is at Wells Fargo, we can do ACH, we can do wires, we can do checks between each other. I don't need to go and join or open an account at Wells Fargo for that payment to be interchanged between the two of us. But if you think about some of the closed payment communities, if you're not part of it, you're going to get a message to join. You got to give them all your information. And what we heard pretty clearly in some of the surveys that we did from both consumers and business users was that, they like to pick their banking or payment relationships, but they don't want to join, 20 or 30 different payment channels and having to manage all these. So they want to do things like they do today, which is 1 or 2 or 3 banks, whatever they leverage, and then have their payments come in and go out as they normally would. If you think about it, for those that have been around long enough, the debit card days, the networks, I don't know if you remember, you actually had to look at the back of your card to see the logos that were on the back and make sure your card would work at that ATM machine. There wasn't a whole lot of interoperability at the beginning of it. You had to make sure you went to the right machine. Today, machine in any bodega, grocery store, anywhere along the way, you're going to have access to your money because the networks have figured out how to interoperate. Same thing with email. You don't care if you're Yahoo, Gmail, or AOL Mail, if anybody still uses that. I don't even know if that still exists. But it just goes.
My mom uses it.
Your mom uses it. Okay. So interoperability is definitely a big question for the task force and something they're going to be looking at very closely. And when I mentioned the challenges and opportunities, if that's something that within the proposals maybe hasn't been clearly addressed or to the satisfaction of the task force, that may be one area that they say more work needs to be done from an interoperability standpoint.
Yeah. One thing, interoperability is really, really hard to actually do. I know we've been talking about this in our little work group, but we actually represent 2 organizations that have one of the few in the world truly interoperable network-to-network connections that actually works at scale. We operate an ACH network, you operate an ACH network, all of us adhering to NACHA rules, and we actually do achieve interoperability every single day. We exchange files, so you don't have to care where your bank works. But it is hard work every single day, and it's not necessarily easy to do. You mentioned the debit cards. And there is some debit card network interoperability, but the way that's actually mostly achieved is the owner of the ATM, the acquirer for the POS terminal, they join with multiple networks, and it's more of a patchwork. And there have been attempts to try to create a model of interoperability that could be applied to an industry that didn't actually work out. If you look at the experience with SEPA in Europe, there was this grand vision where it would work just like our ACHs work. And that's not what happened. It's an interesting patchwork quilt of a lot of bilaterals and one sort of core transport network. And the thing is, debit cards work, SEPA works, what we do works. I think what's interesting is you got to find a way of getting the operators to work together. You got to have a reason, and I think ubiquity is one powerful driver because it makes your product better. But it's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be simple. Can be really messy. I think the key is getting it to work and getting it to work more quickly than the 25 years it took the PN and the Fed to work together, or the 20 years that it took the debit card networks to finally figure it out.
And that's a good point, because some people said, wait, we don't want to go down that path again because we've all lived that. So let's figure this out up front a little bit sooner so we can address it. So, yeah.
I'm on the ubiquity work group. You're on the adoption work group, interoperability.
I'm interoperability, you're interoperability.
Yeah, I'm on the, so ubiquity and interoperability are like different sides of the coin. But we tried to get lessons learned from things like text messaging, which is now globally interoperable, but that was something,
Oh, yeah.
Originally, you could only send text messages to people like on Verizon or on AT&T. And email's another really good example. So we're trying to get lessons learned. Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
I mean, I just think that, PSD2 is going to be an interesting experiment in Europe, and whether or not they can get the standards under control for things like chargebacks and security and all those things that you need to make an actual pan-European system work. Right now, you're just seeing little fiefdoms, like you said, things like Swish and other closed environments. But I think in the U.S., to me, Zelle is an enormous opportunity for the banks. And the banks, in my view, when I think about the missed opportunities, PayPal being the biggest one I can think of, because the banks had that ready to go and couldn't agree to work together on and bring it to market. But Zelle seems to be something that is in the best interest of everybody. The question is, are the banks going to put money behind it? Are they going to tell consumers about it? Or is this just going to be another soft Apple Pay launch where, yes, Apple Pay is gaining a lot of usage around the world in places, but you got to invest money in straight up marketing for these things to take hold. And the banks have seemed incredibly reluctant to do that. And will they do it with Zelle? I don't know.
Zelle is Clear Exchange, right?
Right, the real-time P2P money transfer platform, that's the combination of early warning systems.
The name will be announced next week.
Sorry.
Everybody already knows it.
Okay, but Clear Exchange was spun off.
It's been in the press.
It's spun off to be its own company now?
Well, it's part of EWS.
Yeah, early
Clear Exchange was acquired by EWS.
It was
which is-
originally owned by Wells Fargo, Chase, and Bank of America or something
Yeah.
like that, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to hear about it next week at Money 2020. How exciting. Okay. Craig, I think you kind of gave us a little bit of a insight into this, but do you think that the real-time payments will disrupt the network's traditional business and growth? Or, as you said, transaction is melting like an ice cube, transaction economics, or will they leverage it to expand further and avoid cannibalizing their existing business?
Well, I think it's going to be region by region. I don't see real-time ACH disrupting brick and mortar point of sale in the US anytime soon. I think it's easier to build things online that could potentially do that, like what you're seeing in Europe, where PSD2 is originally going to be targeted, where it's going to be targeted to 7 to 8% of commerce on average that's online. But from, I think, MasterCard's perspective, I think they're going to wind up being long-term indifferent, because from everything we've been able to gather, real-time payments in Europe, at least from a PSD2 or a retail perspective, are going to look a lot like debit when you pull the total economics together of layering services on top. You can't just have real-time payments without actually having service providers who need to have a financial interest in what they're doing. And so, the people believe that at the end of the day, it's going to be around the 20 basis points. That's a regulated debit rate. And so for MasterCard, I think that if they do get approved to buy VocaLink, and they just got lucky that it seems that the European Commission is passing on reviewing that deal, and it's being handled by the UK regulator, which is likely to be more friendly to that acquisition. I think they'll be happy with either way it goes. Visa clearly has an interest in seeing their debit business remain front and center, VPay, whatever you call it around the world. So from MasterCard's perspective, like I said, I think their goal is to be everything to everybody as best they can. For Visa, I think that they would have to view it as a threat. So.
Okay. And
Just one thing.
go ahead.
We get the question a lot, there are winners and losers in anything. And the question we get a lot is, who's the loser with faster payments or any real improvement in payments? And, I think Visa and MasterCard, they're doing all kinds of, they're huge behemoths, and I don't try to weigh in on that. But the one thing that occurs to me is there's a lot of companies that have figured out how to make it in the payments business by overcoming the inefficiencies or the deficiencies of existing payment systems. Now, in many cases, they do that because they have another value proposition, and that's a way of actually making sure they get it to market. But if all you bring to the table is overcoming inefficiencies, I would be scared, because the fact is payment systems are going to get better, whether it's with Fed's doing what we're doing, some of the things that MasterCard, Visa are doing. Payment systems are getting better, and if all you bring to market is overcoming a gap you see now, that gap's going to be gone. And so I think that's who really could stand to lose in this.
Well, that's an interesting argument because there's one group of companies, and I don't want to offend anybody in the room if you happen to work within that group of companies, that I think is very rapidly moving toward the age of the dinosaur, which is the merchant acquirers. They earn a profit margin that is, in my mind, egregious by a factor of 5, and they are becoming highly commoditized, and what they offer is a box with buttons and connectivity to a network that can be frankly put in place by anybody, and they'd be happy to make a profit that, like I said, is a quarter the size. And JP Morgan Chase is laying the gauntlet down right now by willing to offer payment tech as a loss leader to drive other parts of their business.
Another example that died before it was even born was MCX's currency. It was originally, come up with paying through ACH to avoid on debit interchange, and then Durbin came along and wiped out the difference really between ACH and debit, so very good. So Anand, I've heard some people in the press call it not VocaLink, but now MasterLink. Is this going to give MasterCard a huge presence in non-card payments?
Clearly, right? And I think, we've talked a lot about it already. Yeah, clearly a presence, not just in non-card payments, non-card real-time payments. And at the end of the day, Voca is a technology competent, it's essentially a platform that can be leveraged by a lot of people. And I think you're using what they bought is an asset, is a working technology for real-time payments. Currently, it's non-card based. It could be expanded to be real card based. And more importantly, I think the value they see is taking it global, taking it everywhere else, and becoming the backbone. So, very strategic move. And I think I guess they realize that they can build a platform anytime soon with so little risk that they just adopt, they use Voca as the starting point for their real-time payment infrastructure for all payment types all over the world.
Okay, and getting your crystal balls out, Craig mentioned a few things that Visa maybe feels a little bit behind in analytics or loyalty. I don't know. What other things might we expect these two big networks to do in the future?
Okay. Well, I think Visa, like I said, I think they're tied down right now. Charlie announcing his departure last night was a huge surprise. Bringing Al on made a ton of sense because he was intimate with the details of the Visa Europe acquisition, the multi-district litigation, the regulatory changes. He's been watching all this from the board level, and he clearly was able to step in a difficult situation quickly. As far as I understand it, Charlie informed the board less than a month ago that he was thinking about this and resigned literally yesterday. And so it was a very quick transition. So you have to wonder if they're going to have the bandwidth to be thinking outside the box to the degree that others will be. But at the same time, when you're number one and you're twice the size of the next guy, you're the hammer, and you just have to keep doing what you're doing until someone says you can't anymore, right? And so MasterCard, I think, is going to continue to emphasize their services business while not taking their eye off the ball on the core. I think that over the next few years, it's going to be very interesting to see if what the W3C is trying to do with e-commerce, bringing the payment into the browser, similar to the way Apple Pay is working and Android Pay will work on the web, will truly disrupt what is essentially now a redundant product in PayPal but has enormous momentum. And so I think that the changes are going to be interesting. I think Visa and MasterCard, as long as they play their cards right, no pun intended, can stay in the middle. I said to Visa 5 years ago at a presentation that my view was these companies need to do their best to become invisible, fade into the background, continue to charge de minimis economics on a per transaction level, 10 basis points, 10 to 20 basis points. And as long as they provide the best tools in the industry, why no VC firm in their right mind would invest in a company to try to compete with Visa and MasterCard at a 10 basis point price point. It just, as long as they keep doing what they're doing, they should be fine.
I at one time thought that China UnionPay was going to try and take on Visa, but recently I haven't seen many moves from their part.
Well, they have to worry about Visa and MasterCard now attacking their home territory, and they also have to worry about Alipay and Tenpay destroying what they have in China. Mm-hmm. So they've had to, my guess, I met with them in Shanghai in 2012. At the time, they were all guns blazing, and now I expect they're shoring up their defenses at home.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
Well, I have to agree. There's a whole lot easier ways of making money than going out and saying, I'm going to take on Visa or MasterCard.
Yeah.
I don't tend to walk into bars and punch the biggest guy there. And so, if you were to, what's going to happen? Will they continue to make these strategic investments? I think, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Maybe one day it adds up to some real money, but quite frankly, that's kind of like calling Google. Oh, they're that thermostat company, right? Yeah. No. About a thermostat company, but they are a big internet search engine. I think these guys, they're going to be big players in payments, primarily card-based or whatever you call the future of card-based payments, for a long time because they're just so freaking big. It'll take a long time for them to be anything but that. That doesn't mean they're investing in other ways to expand their business, and I think time will see which ones actually pay off.
Yeah, I see MasterCard continuing to invest, like he said, in the processing business. That's their above average order and, probably their biggest growth. So the third party processors, if you take outside the US, are probably the people who are going to get impacted the most by the moves that they make because, they'll be outside looking in with the rails that MasterCard and or Visa and everybody else builds.
So you think MasterCard will have an impact on small country-based credit card processors because they have more scale?
Absolutely. And I think, if you see what they're doing, building globally, they're trying to put together a common global processing platform. They've achieved it to a large extent between Europe and Asia, but, it's a question of including the US, mm-hmm. and it will be a threat to the smaller countries' processing platforms.
So, audience, yes.
So I know we're here to discuss primarily the networks like MasterCard and Visa, but there's the other card companies called American Express. So can you just comment on, are they even relevant in this space?
Let me repeat the question for the people on the webinar is comment on Amex. I guess you could say Discover too. And, yeah. Are they even relevant? God forbid, I know there's a lot of people from Amex in here, so.
I'm not from Amex.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the easy one first, which is Discover. I don't think Discover has been a relevant network payment provider in the better part of 40 years. I mean, they, frankly, I think that when they bought, the network outside, when they bought Diners from Citi, I think, for lack of a better term, they were trying to put lipstick on a pig to sell the business. Because at the time, you had UnionPay, Barclays, and others who thought there was enormous value in owning a global payment network for themselves. Now, management made the right call because at the time, this was during the recession, they were trading at $12 a share. Barclays offered $16.50, and now they're trading between 50 and 60. So it would never have been the right decision. But in my view, the CEO has this crazy view that he has to have a payment network. It doesn't make money. In a lot of quarters, in fact, it loses money. And I think that they could be a far more valuable franchise if they shut the network off and put Visa and MasterCard in little tiny letters on the back of their cards and doubled or tripled acceptance overnight and still had the Discover brand. But he has to own a network. Now, what Discover is a phenomenal risk management organization in terms of lending money and whatnot, but they are not innovative. They offer you cash back, and there's not much else there. And as long as they can keep that going, then they're viable. American Express, on the other hand, is an enormously interesting group of assets. The network is legitimately a good piece of technology, right? And the franchise value of the Amex brand is up there in the top 100 globally. But they have severe challenges, mainly for, in my opinion, one huge reason. Yes, Chase is extremely formidable, but if you look directly after the recession, there were two players that were building market share, Amex and Chase, because at that point it was the two best players in the industry who were doing what they do. But two things happened. Credit became extremely benign, and interest rates went way down. And so that's never happened before. You usually either have terrible credit and low interest rates, or high rates and great credit. So now what you've done is you've enabled all these second-rate issuers to just simply throw cash at the problem. And cash back is now this behemoth in the rewards game that appeals to many, 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 many demographics. And Amex has had to play that game. And it's a game that you don't associate Amex with, but frankly, I jumped from putting all my spending on my Platinum card to the Citi Double Cash card because it's just a great return and I don't have to think about it. And I think the challenge for Amex is how do you stay relevant? And right now they're going the easy path while they retrench, which is accelerate loan growth and drive shareholder return that way. But at some point, they're going to have to slow that down. I think that one of their best opportunities is in small business finance, and I think they should be pushing that extremely aggressively. Doing things like what Square is doing with Merchant Cash Advance and others are doing in that direction. But at the end of the day, the brand is there. It might take. I have enormous respect for Ken. But look, if you want a conspiracy theory, a year from now, Charlie Scharf is probably looking for a new job and Ken Chenault's turning 67.
That's the second supposition I've heard of Charlie Scharf's next job tonight.
So
That's a very interesting perspective. And when you mentioned about Discover, they were the first to sign up with China UnionPay maybe 5-6 years ago as an interoperability place. So that sort of speaks to what you were saying, that they were...
Discover won't talk about that agreement anymore. From what I understand, it went completely sour.
Yeah.
I'm just fascinated they were irrelevant 10 years before they were launched.
No, but weren't they Sears and...
Just kidding.
They were...
No, they came out of Sears, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, what they established was technical interoperability. There wasn't any
Right.
money behind branding. There wasn't any.
But I'm sure it still works, where if you have a China UnionPay card, you could use it at a Discover.
Except most merchants don't know.
right.
You stick a Discover card in China or India, they stare at it and say, "What do I do with this?"
Yeah.
Right, even though it's interoperable.
So I have a question for you. I mean, one area of truly potential growth as opposed to cannibalizing and stealing share are B2B payments. But there are many, many challenges for B2B payments. Do faster payments somehow really make it easier, or is it still just so complicated because of all the different ERP systems, et cetera? But because that's really a huge source of growth for who can ever crack it. Everything else is kind of stealing from somebody.
Right, so the question is, B2B is one area where we're not necessarily cannibalizing, but it's kind of a hard area to attack. But also, Amex has got such an unassailable lead in commercial cards that it seems like it
That's
would
still
tend
just
to-
T&E. It's not
yeah.
everything else.
When we designed our approach to faster payments, we built it with B2B, not B&B, B2B in mind. Although you could use it at B&B, I guess. First of all, speed is probably not the most important aspect for B2B. But there are certain byproducts of speed that are really kind of interesting. When you can collapse down the sending of a message, the clearing of the transaction, the settlement of the transaction, and access to cash into a single point in time, you get rid of remarkable amounts of things like reconcilement cost. You give companies the ability to pay when they want to pay. You could actually fit this into a dynamic term setting type of a trade term setting type of an environment. It'd be fairly straightforward to do because you can trigger the payment when you want. And so those things, the direct byproducts of speed, are actually pretty compelling when you look at that. But the other thing is, you want to look at more than just the payment itself. And some of the things that we built into our platform are a very robust request for payment capability, which is used to deliver bills or invoices. It can do that while also attaching to voluminous amounts of remittance data. And we're finding a lot of interest in that because right now there are ways of doing invoice delivery, but they tend to be walled gardens. You find if I'm going pay mode to pay mode or Ariba to Ariba, it can work. But once you get outside, and very few companies can get everybody inside the same tent. So the idea of a generalized capability to deliver an invoice is also important. The immediate confirmation that is typically associated with a real-time payment system is also a big deal because knowing that a payment has been made, again, it collapses all of that reconcilement that needs to be done. And then finally, when you look in a smart way at the way to link things like that request for payment or invoice delivery to the payment itself, to confirmation messages, to fulfillment messages, to extend remittance, all of which are supported, and you find ways of logically linking those, it helps with things like the three-way matches that you need to do. We thought about all of these things when we designed the system. Now, one thing, we're not designing end-user applications, we're designing a core network. But by building these things into the core network, we think it's going to actually make it a heck of a lot easier for folks to build compelling applications, whether it's the existing players who can now go outside their own net, or if it's someone coming up with a totally novel way of presenting and paying these invoices. We think we're betting big on that.
Yeah, so before we get to that, let me just add kind of a real world example. So I was probably 2 years ago, I was starting to talk about some of these things that we were doing with the task forces and getting this process up and running and highlighting some of the potential use cases that we highlighted in our paper. And B2B was one of the big ones that was highlighted. And I had a lady in the audience, she stood up and she had a question for me and she said, I'm an accounts receivable manager at a gravel yard. I was like, okay, where's this one gonna go? And she's like, every day I have dump trucks sitting in my gravel yard lined up for hours waiting for me to give the release to the loaders to load that truck when I have confirmation that the payment was received. And she says they're lined up for hours burning diesel because I can't get the confirmation that a wire was received. So wire, right? That's our fastest payment method today besides cash. But when you think about it, from initiation to receipt and confirmation, that could be a couple of hours to know that wire was actually made and received. So something that Steve described where somebody makes a payment, there's a confirmation, the accounts receivable manager says, yep, send that guy on his way with his load of gravel and he's out of there. And she's like, this would totally streamline our whole process because the payment is the clog that's holding up that process.
Thank you for that visceral example.
Yeah.
That's great. We have a question here. I just want to check in with Bill. Are there any questions from the web?
Nope.
No? Okay, go ahead.
Just sort of following what you were saying, Steve, and then plays into your story there, Dan. blockchain seems to solve a lot of these problems, and I'm assuming from the sound of it that that's not the technology going down, and I know there's a first mover here, nobody really wants to act on using blockchain, but if you have pre-verified KYC and KYV, know your customer and vendor, it could speed up things, and you could use blockchain for everything.
We took a hard look at blockchain.
The comment was blockchain could also solve this.
Yeah, we took a hard look at blockchain, and again, one of the things we needed to come to market, we need to come to market now. The need was here. Blockchain is a fascinating technology. I think we're going to find all kinds of useful things to do with it. But some of the things we had to solve for weren't being solved for with the current versions of blockchain distributed ledger. One of them was speed. And the fact is, if you look at hash rates and such, the time it takes to create a block to, bring a payment in, or even if you look at consensus systems, they weren't meeting what was seen as being the speed need. So now that's something I think is solvable. We're going to look at, I think, blockchain v 3.0 or whatever it is, could very well deal with that, but it wasn't something we could use immediately. There's also, and this is one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, but blockchain is a very expensive technology, and we had to find a way of getting this down to pennies a transaction. And so, and you can't do that currently with any of the iterations of blockchain. It doesn't mean they won't get there, but again, we needed to get to cheap. And we also needed to get to very, very high throughput. We determined that we would need to be able to handle at certain peak periods 5,000 transactions a second, not database read writes, but 5,000 complete transactions. There's not a technology to do that now. Now that doesn't mean it won't be there in the future. We're building in a modular way that we can update certain components, if that makes sense, but we needed to get there now.
Yes.
So as you guys are moving faster, which is obviously a great goal, it's going to make things more valuable. Are you seeing new areas of fraud or risk being exposed, or new areas of avenues that people might take advantage of?
So the question is, being faster, does it make it any more risky or any more fraud prone?
You're looking at me, huh?
No, I don't want to.
Yeah, I can take a step. I mean, I made the comment earlier that you can't just do this in a vacuum of payment speed. It's got to be safety and security as well with the payment. And I think everybody knows of the challenges that some of the payment process have experienced over the last couple of years with breaches and compromises of different data. So taking that into context, you certainly have to take a look at how you manage safety and security while enhancing the speed process of the payment. So, you probably have two camps that are still out there. Some are saying if you speed it up, it's going to make it more risky. And others have said if you speed it up, it's going to make your processes around payment safety stronger because you're going to have to do it quicker and you're going to have to address it. So you look at some of the channels that are, or some of the other countries that have implemented real-time payments. UK, for example, when they implemented, did have a spike in fraud. There were some things that they missed. And to Steve's earlier point, going first is not necessarily always the best thing because you can learn from some of these experiences. But you look at them now and it's one of their most secure payment channels, across their system. Other countries that have implemented have learned from that and have very low fraud incidences. So it's all about how you manage it and the processes and protocols that you put in place. But again, the task force was very clear. Again, a third of those criteria, just about a third, focus on payment safety and security. So they really wanted the providers to shore up and explain how they would facilitate that process.
Yeah, some of the things we learned is you have to think about it, and you have to think about it differently. First of all, most faster payment systems are credit transfer systems. So you don't have the big exposure right now is fraudulent debits. You don't have the fraudulent debits, but then it focuses the attention on account takeover, unauthorized payments, and that was what hit the UK. It exposed existing flaws in the system, and that they weren't using multi-factor authentication, things like that, and those were the banks that got hit. Now, it didn't make the system less safe, but it gave the bad guys a faster getaway car, was the way I liked it. Someone would explain it to me. So you need to think about that. The other thing is, if your current way of dealing with fraudulent transactions is to say, this one looks a little scary, we're going to put it over in this queue and have somebody take a look at it. You can't do that when your response time is seconds. And so you, as Dan mentioned, you have to come up with a faster and a more automated process. what we're seeing is that there are ways of doing that, but you have to make sure you implement them. And so it's not just going to happen. And if you don't think about it, you will get hit with fraud.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Rodman?
Yes. Given all the answers that we've heard tonight, how will those answers change when you move from a Fed funds rate of 1/4 to 0.5% to 3 or 4%?
So the question is, how does a change in Fed funds rate impact what we're talking about?
Yes.
From very low now to something a little higher, yeah.
If I answer that question, does that imply that rates are going up? Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I don't know that I have a good answer for it, but it does impact float and availability and all those things which are addressed in some of the criteria. So, today, people, if they don't get available funds for 1 or 2 days, not a big deal, but if it's 3 or 4%, how quickly you can get those funds in and processed would probably have some type of an impact, but I'm not sure if I know
So you're
exactly.
saying that could be a big driver if interest rates go up, people want
Yeah,
their
I
money right
mean,
away.
that's like we used to fly checks around in Lear jets because you could get them there quicker to get availability on the funds. So, it did change the dynamics, and as interest rates went down, people put them back on the regular trucks to get them across the country. So, interest rates definitely do have an impact on how people choose to move their payments.
Yeah. I think we're actually a little bit lucky we're in a very low interest rate environment right now in one way, in that we don't actually know what the impact on cash flow is going to be of faster payments. There are senders, there are receivers, and I think it's going to take a while to get a feel for what the impact is. Doing that while interest rates are low, so the consequences of getting a little bit wrong, having a little bit too much excess funds here or there, are not as dire as they would be otherwise. Now, the flip side of that is, with interest rates as low as they are, it's squeezing bank profits, and so trying to make the case for the investment in faster payments in this environment is tougher. So there's gives and takes there.
Okay, and with that, I just want to say one more thing before we close is, I forgot to mention in the beginning, that Opus, everybody from Opus, raise your hand. We have like 5 or 6 people here from Opus. Opus is a generous sponsor of NYPAY, not just this event, but in general, so we would like to thank you, Anand, and the rest of our Opus colleagues here. And I'd like to give a warm applause to the panel. I think you guys did a great job addressing a really interesting topic, so thank you.
Thank you.